Ok. Então, uma boa noite para todas e todos. Meu nome é Marcos Silva. Isso é muito bacana poder apresentar aqui mais uma... Deixa eu só me organizar aqui. Então, eu sou Marcos Silva, sou o atual presidente da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia Analítica. É um prazer receber todas e todos para esse ciclo de palestras da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia Analítica. Eu queria, antes de passar a palavra para o nosso apresentador, o nosso palestrante, conferencista de hoje, o Ben Martin, falar dois tópicos. Eu queria agradecer publicamente a organização desse ciclo de palestras da SBFA. Foi uma iniciativa da professora Beatriz Sorrentino, a gente implementou isso, e também a ajuda dos bastidores do Matheus Rawls, aqui da UFPE. Então, muito obrigado, acho que está acontecendo muito bem, bom para que a gente coordene esforços e consiga entender, ter um panorama, assim, de coisas que vários pesquisadores estão fazendo, tá? Na nossa comunidade de filosofia analítica, tanto nacional como internacional. E o segundo ponto é convidar todo mundo, todos e todas, para o nosso evento ano que vem. Vai ser um evento muito bacana, esse pós-pandemia, em Olinda, tá? É uma cidade histórica, belíssima, em Pernambuco, tá? Um patrimônio histórico da humanidade. A gente encontrou um lugar super bonito lá no alto da Praça da Sé, para quem a gente conhece, com todo mundo, todas e todos convidados. Então, coloquem na agenda de vocês. Vai ser na última semana de julho do ano que vem. Então, tem bastante tempo para organizar. O Call for Papers, o Call for Abstracts vai ser lançado em breve, tá? Acredito até agora dezembro. Então, fiquem de olho nas nossas redes sociais. Então, eu vou mudar agora para o inglês. Switching to English. So it's a great pleasure here to receive Ben Martin. I will introduce Ben Martin very shortly here. So Ben Martin is an assistant professor in logic and philosophy of science at the University of Padua, but he's not in Italy right now. He's in a big tour, interesting tour through South America, and he's kind enough to have accepted our invitation to be here and give this talk as well. So Ben Martin is also interested directly in philosophical logic and epistemology of logic, and also in logical paradoxes and the relationship between logic and the science. He has coordinated a huge project. No, I think in Bergen, maybe we can talk a little bit about this, on abductive methodology in the philosophy of logic. That's the reason why I know his work as well. And also he has visited Brazil a few years ago during a huge logic conference in Natal, here our neighbors in northeast part of Brazil, which was organized by João Marcos group there in Natal that period in the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte. So Ben Martin, Ben, we are very excited to have you here and to hear your talk, and then talk a little bit about your research. And the talk today is going to be on the reflective equilibrium in logic, the application of the reflective equilibrium in logic, and all the philosophical, interesting philosophical problems that we have here. So the word is all yours. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcos. Thank you. So I'm just going to share my my slides. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Yep. So yes, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Not sure why that's showing. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to present my work to you. What I'm going to talk to you today about is a particular account of the epistemology of logic, which is known as reflective equilibrium about logic. So reflective equilibrium has been applied to many different topics within ethics, within political philosophy, and also just within philosophy itself, but it started off applying to logic. Let me just to take a step back, just clarify what I mean when I talk particularly about the epistemology of logic, which I have an opportunity to talk a bit more detail about shortly. But when people use the term logic and the epistemology of logic, it's sometimes ambiguous as to what they mean. Sometimes when people talk about the epistemology of logic, they mean the epistemology of good inferences. Now, that isn't what I mean here, and that isn't what is meant within the context of reflective equilibrium about logic. Reflective equilibrium logic is a theory about how we construct our best theory of logic. That is our best logical theory, whether that be classical logic, intuitive logic, some kind of paradoxical logic, so on and so forth. Okay, so it's about how we extract from certain data that we deem to be a reliable indication of the best logic, and somehow use that data, extract from that logic the correct logical principles. Okay, so while we now talk about reflective equilibrium in the context of many different areas of research, it was actually proposed by Nelson Goodman in 1983 in his Fiction Forecast book as an account of how to go about justifying our theory of logic. And the basic principle is this, that we don't have direct access to the correct logic or the correct logical principles, but rather what we have to do is we have to start with some initial judgments about what we count as being good inferences or valid inferences. And then somehow we extract from that and those initial judgments, okay, which may be everyday judgments to be determined, and then we extract from those judgments our basic logical principles. And actually, Goodman goes on to apply this not only to deductive logic, but also inductive logic. Now, this picture of reflective equilibrium, the idea is that you've got some kind of equilibrium ultimately then resting between the initial judgments about what's good, a good inference, and our theory, the logical principles. This is now quite a popular account of how the epistemology of logic works. So you find it in Brun, Peregrine and Svoboda, and also in Resnick. Now, one of the concerns that I have about reflective equilibrium generally, but particularly when it comes to logic, is that it would be quite strange if we were to have a methodology for theories such that that methodology for how we go about evidencing our theory in a particular domain were applicable to other domains without having to take into account the particulars of the research area. Now, some of you may know there is this research program in the philosophy of logic known as anti-exceptionalism about logic, of which I'm a part. And the idea there is that that logic is more similar to the sciences than is often appreciated, particularly when it comes to its methodology or its epistemology. That may be true, okay, but we need to argue for that claim. So we should certainly be suspicious of the proposal that there is this grand theory about how we accommodate data and theory such that it applies to the sciences, ethics, philosophy, and logic. And basically, the concern is that if we're just saying all reflective equilibrium says is there's some data, there's some theory, and we want to find some kind of compatibility, some kind of fit between them, if that's all reflective equilibrium says, then it lacks specificity. That in effect, it buys its reasonableness only because it lacks specificity. And this concern is phrased quite nicely by Richard Foley. Okay, there's a nice quote there that you can read in your own time there on the slides. So if we want reflective equilibrium to be a detailed and accurate account of the epistemology of logic, we need to know certain other factors which haven't really been detailed in any kind of consideration in the literature, or at least I don't think as well as need to be. And that is, what are these data exactly, these judgments that we supposedly have about everyday examples? What's the nature of this data? What is the theory that we're fitting the data to or evaluating it in relationship to? How do we, in effect, recognize conflicts between the two of them? And how do we resolve exactly these conflicts? Okay. So what I'm going to show today, hopefully, or discuss, is I just want to identify, by looking at these different moving parts when it comes to reflective equilibrium, I want to look at which of these variables for each of the which value for each of the variables should we choose. So how should we interpret the data? How should we interpret the theory? How should we interpret the conflict? How should we go about adequately resolving such conflicts to ultimately come up with what I consider to be an optimal version of RE about logic? Okay, now just a little bit of context for the rest of this talk is that this talk is in effect taken from a part of a paper which is hopefully shortly to be forthcoming, where I argue that once we have a clear idea about this optimal account of reflective equilibrium we're going to say logic is, it's going to turn out being something like logical predictivism, which is a position that I've argued for previously. Okay, what I'm going to do today, though, actually is just highlight an optimal account of RE about logic. So what would the best version of reflective equilibrium about logic look like exactly? And then still, even given that optimal version, highlight there are some problems for RE about logic. Okay, even despite some of these benefits this optimal version has over its parent or its siblings. So a few preliminaries before we get going, because I think that RE about logic can sometimes be misinterpreted, because its own advocates sometimes call it what we call a weakly foundationalist account of logic's epistemology. But this notion of RE being a weakly foundationalist epistemology of logic or epistemology is partly caused by confusion over what the epistemology is about. So in the epistemology of logic, broadly speaking, we have two camps. We have the foundationalist camp, who propose that we have direct access to principles of logic. So the most famous example of this are those individuals such as Lawrence Bonjour, who suggests that we have direct insight into the direct principles of logic. Okay, so through this quasi-perceptual rational faculty, we just see that modus ponens is valid, or we just see that the law of non-contradiction is true. That's foundationalism. So we have direct access to these logical principles that make up our logic. All of them, or a subset of, doesn't matter which one, okay? At least some privileged laws we have direct access to. Then we have non-foundationalist epistemologies, and according to non-foundationalists, we do not have this unmediated access to any logical laws. What we have to do instead is make inferences from some data that we deem to be reliable, and from that data, we make inferences to the correct principles. Okay, so as a means of analogy here, the non-foundationalist thinks that our theorizing about logic is similar in this respect to that of the sciences, in the sense that we don't have direct access to whether a scientific principle is true. We have to start with certain data, normally observational data, and then from that observational data, we can make certain inferences and then further test it, come up with hypotheses, and then test those theories, those hypotheses on the basis of further data. Okay, and that's how non-foundationalists see things. Okay, now I don't talk about this in any detail whatsoever, but let it just be said that foundationalists epistemology of logic face significant problems. Firstly, in the dubious source of evidence they appeal to, namely rational insight, the idea that in our minds we somehow have direct access to the truth of logical principles. Okay, that there's anything other than naturalistic observational data that we can rely upon, or linguistic data. That actually there's this third realm that we can have access to through rational insight. And they also tend to, and I've explored this in my previous work, they tend to distort actual logical disagreements. So if foundationalism were correct, we would expect logical disagreements to be very different to actually how they function in the literature. We would expect people to be appealing to just intuitions about modus ponens itself, not about instances of modus ponens or instances of arguments, but literally about the law of modus ponens itself or the law of non-contradiction, so on and so forth. Okay, that's not really what we find happen. Now, to go, and this is what motivates non-foundationalist epistemology logic. Now, to go back to reflective equilibrium about logic, sometimes in the literature you find individuals who support reflective equilibrium suggesting that, well, the failure of foundationalist accounts of the epistemology of logic motivate RE about logic, reflective equilibrium about logic, because it is in effect the non-foundationalist account when it comes to the epistemology of logic. But that isn't actually the case. There are multiple non-foundationalist epistemology of logic available. There is Quinian evidential holism, there is abductivism about logic, and predictivism. Now, I haven't got a lot of time to go into exactly what differentiates these, but let me just say one or two words about how they are often seen to be different from one another. And if some people are interested in the Q&A, I can certainly address this more. This is something which I've discussed with my co-author Ulla Hjorlund in recent work. So here's a difference between the proposals. So Quinian evidential holism thinks of logic as just being part of the web of belief, and we evaluate logic, which is at the core. We evaluate logic using the exact same evidence and on exactly the same basis that we evaluate all of our theories, namely through observational data, ultimately. And when there's a predictive error, we have to evaluate something in our web of belief somewhere, and if all else fails, we actually then reevaluate our logical theory, we revise it. Okay, so the idea is that the logic is just part of the whole web of belief, and we evaluate it when we come across recalcitrant data. Abductivism doesn't treat logic necessarily as just part of the overall web. It has its own privileged data, which different proponents provide different answers to, but some of them think that it's exactly like the proponents of RE do, which is its judgments about individual arguments. That's certainly the case for Graham Priest. And the idea is we evaluate the theory on the basis of the fit with that data, notion of fit with the data, okay, conforming to the data, and also that we choose it on the basis of its overall theoretical virtues. Okay, now abductivism certainly is the closest that it comes to RE about logic. One of the differences, though, is that abductivism tends to think about the way that we evaluate logical theories not in a piecemeal fashion, but actually as whole enclosed logics already. So given logics. So we have the logical theory, and we evaluate the logical theory, whether it be classical logic, intuitionism, or irrelevant logic, paraconsistent logic, on the basis then of the data, not in a piecemeal fashion where we evaluate each logical principle according to certain instances. Predictivism is another game completely. According to predictivism, we evaluate logical theories on the basis of successful predictions. So we start with certain initial cases, just like RE proposes, and then we formulate hypotheses, just like in the sciences, and then test those theories through predictions and through the explanatory power of them. Okay, and again, if you're interested in this picture, I can talk more about it later in the Q&A, and also there's a reference there to the work. But if we're talking about reflective equilibrium, there's some interesting questions to ask. Firstly, how exactly is RE about logic different from these other proposals, and in what sense is it superior? Because at the moment in the literature, there isn't a suitable distinction made between RE about logic and these other proposals, and also there is no discussion as to in what sense it's superior to these other proposals. So one of the things I hope for us to do in the rest of the day is just get a sense of nail down what the most reasonable version of RE about logic is, and then we can go into just talking more about exactly how then does it differ from the other proposals, and is it better than them? Okay. Before I get though onto just talking in more detail about RE, just a few words about how to go about evaluating these different versions of RE about logic. Okay. So the first is we need to fix what I mean by the epistemology of logic. And I've said a few words about this. So when we're talking about the epistemology of logic here, we're not talking about what logicians do in what we call pure logic. So I'm not interested in what virtues and criteria do pure logicians use when they're assessing what a viable proof is, when they're trying to determine, for example, when a logic is sound and complete. I'm not assessing what's considered to be a good proof system. okay, for a logic. I'm interested here in the application of a calculi, of a logical system to a given application. And particularly, although there isn't just one application of applying a logic, or sometimes people talk about modeling a particular target system, target phenomenon. What I'm interested in particularly, there are multiple different possible phenomena. Grammaticality is one. We use linear logic to model grammaticality. We have many different models for belief revision using non-monotonic logics, but also probabilistic models and modal logics. What I'm particularly interested in today, though, is the target system or phenomenon often known as validity or logical consequence itself, which is the idea that there is something that underlines natural language arguments or mathematical arguments that makes them valid. Okay, and the idea is that we can actually come up with a logic that explains or accommodates what makes these arguments good arguments. Okay, that's the application we're interested in today. The second point I want to make about how we go about assessing epistemology logic is that, as with any research area, you can distinguish between how is the epistemology currently now, as in, like, what do logicians actually do when they're doing the epistemology, when they're formulating and justifying their logics, and also how should they go about doing it? Because it could be they're making a mistake. Okay, so if we go all the way back to the scientific revolution, we might think that certain of the criteria that we use to assess a good scientific theory, whether in terms of some kind of concern about action at a distance, shouldn't have been a criterion that was used when evaluating, or mechanistic philosophy, whether it should be used when evaluating the correct theory. What we're going to be focusing on today is assuming that the best guide to how we go about doing something is about how we actually do it. So this is known as the practice-based approach. So most of my research assumes the practice-based approach. I do argue for the practice-based approach elsewhere, but most of my research into the methodology and the epistemology logic is very much assuming that we learn about the epistemology of a field, whether that be the sciences, whether it be about logic, mathematics, by looking at what the experts in that field actually do. Note not what they say, because sometimes people aren't very good at reflecting on their own practice, but it's very much in terms of what are they actually doing. So the idea is we can look at the types of evidence that logicians actually give for their theories, the types of disagreements that actually occur in these fields, and by looking at these kinds of evidence and the kinds of disagreements that occur, we can extract a reasonable epistemology of the logic. Okay, so that's all the background. Now let's get into talking about let's talk a little bit about how the reflective equilibrium itself works. So this is the original quote from the Goodman text, which tells us about how we should think about reflective equilibrium according to Goodman. Note that as far as Goodman is concerned, the justification for these logical principles consists solely in the principle's agreement with these initial judgments about instances of good inferences. So there is nothing that can justify these logical principles over and above their agreement with our initial judgments about this particular inference or this particular inference. So the general idea is we have some pre-theoretical, it's supposed, pre-theoretical judgments about instances of inferences or arguments. And these judgments we can found to be either reasonable or acceptable or unacceptable. And from these initial judgments about what's acceptable or what's unacceptable, we can then infer rules of inference, which, when combined, form our logic of validity. So we have a judgment, let's say that the inference from if I go shopping, then I'm going to buy some popcorn. I've gone shopping, therefore I've bought some popcorn. That the acceptability over that judgment gives me reason to think that the inference of modus ponens is a valid rule of reasoning. And once I've formed up enough of these rules together, I then can construct a theory of logic that is just the combination of these different rules of inference. That's the idea. And I check these rules of inference against then further instances. Okay. If I find no counterexamples, as it were, if I find that every judgment about a given instance is in agreement with these principles, then all is okay. Okay, that can be accordance with the principles in terms of that every instance is acceptable, or that if I think that a rule is not okay, I can at least find certain examples of that rule which I think the instances of them are not okay. Okay, they're not acceptable instances of that argument schema. So the idea is over time to come through this constructive process where I reach a state of reflective equilibrium between the data, taking the form of instances of particular inference instances about acceptability and unacceptability, and the principles. If they're in tension with one another, something's got to give, either on the data side or on the theory side. And actually, we're not told exactly where that tension is somehow reconciled, but it's got to be reconciled somewhere. Okay. Now, a few notable points about Goodman's initial articulation. Goodman's version of RE is what we call a narrow form of reflective equilibrium. That means that there is nothing over and above that the judgments of instances which inform the theory. So narrow RE is to be contrasted with what we call wide RE, wide reflective equilibrium, which allows for wider background assumptions to also be fed into the reflective equilibrium process. I'll get an opportunity to talk about this later. Secondly, as far as Goodman is concerned, what actually constitutes a theory are just rules of inference, clusters of rules of inference. Again, that's not the only way of thinking about this. We're going to look at about other ways to think about this shortly. And again, not all advocates of RE agree about this. Third, Goodman is not clear exactly about what the content of the judgments are. Sometimes he talks about the judgments about the instance being just about what's acceptable or good. Sometimes he talks about what's valid or invalid. So are these judgments about instances just in terms of what's good or bad inference, or acceptable or unacceptable, or rather what's valid, invalid? And as we're going to go on to see, they're not all equally as reasonable proposals. And lastly, Goodman doesn't actually specify who the subjects of this reflective equilibrium are. Okay, he doesn't clarify whether we all as individuals come up with our own state of reflective equilibria, or whether this is some kind of communal operation where we get together and we assess the data together, and then we assess what the correct theory of logic based upon this data is. And this is going to be important because there are some advocates of RE who are very individualistic in their interpretation of how RE works, and others who are communal, and both these interpretations are not equally plausible. So I'm going to take these different considerations in turn, starting with how we ought to interpret the data, then moving on to how we ought to think about the theory. So you remember these were questions we started with initially. Reflective equilibrium doesn't specify what the data are exactly, what the theory is, and then how to look about the relationship between them. Then I'll move on to talking about whether we ought to be thinking in terms of wide or narrow reflective equilibrium when it comes to logic. And lastly, I'm going to look at trying to determine what the optimal version of RE is. I'm going to look at whether we ought to think about this individualistically or communally as in an enterprise in logic. So let's start with what the data are, okay, when it comes to logic. And there are three broad interpretations of what could be going on here when we talk about reflective equilibrium. We can have a naive version, and I don't mean in any way anything prescriptive about this when I say naive at this moment in time. What I mean by naive is just literally the content of the data is equivalent to the content of the theory. Now, we already said that the content of our theory are theories about validity. So that meant that a naive version of the data would just be reading the data as being itself about validity. So the naive version of RE reads the judgments, the content of the judgments just being about the logical validity or invalidity of the inferences, the individual inferences. Okay, so here the content of the judgments about the instances are the same as the content of our theories about the rules of inference, so about the valid rules of inference. That's to be contrasted with operationalized RE. Now, operationalized RE doesn't propose that the content of the inferences are the same as the content of the theory. Rather, the content of the inferences are distinct, and these judgments are deemed to be reliable indications of the phenomenon. Okay, and this distinction between the phenomenon and the data, and them not having the same content, is quite well known, I think, now in the philosophy of science. The classic example is that when particle physicists are attempting to identify alpha and beta particles, we don't directly observe or detect alpha and beta particles. We don't directly observe them. What we do see, rather, using a cloud chamber, is we see the condensation trails of or vapor trails of certain particles. Okay, so the idea similarly here would be, in the case of logic, is that people do not have theoretical judgments about the validity of instances of arguments, but what they really have, though, are pre-theoretical judgments about the goodness or viability, let's say acceptability of inferences, and then that data is deemed to be a reliable indicator of facts about validity. Okay, and in the most famous case of the operationalized RE, it's not necessarily just everyday judgments about a good argument, but really mathematicians' judgments about what constitutes a good inference. And then we've also got generalized RE, which is building upon naive RE. So naive RE, remember, says that our judgments about instances has the same content as the theories themselves. So we make judgments about what's a valid or invalid instance of an argument. Generalized RE says that actually we go further than that. We actually have judgments about principles of logic. So we can judge directly that a particular rule of inference is a good one. Okay, and ought to therefore be included in our theory. Okay. I'll have concerns about this in a second, but firstly, let me just talk about why I think operationalized RE is preferable to naive RE. So firstly, validity is a technical term, which means that validity was introduced to be able to explain why certain arguments were good arguments. And we only had the concept of RE, the concept of validity, really in its modern day sense, with subsequent to model theory, and particularly Tarski, and we forget this. Okay, we had, of course, this very unsophisticated notion in terms of truth in all possible worlds, or inconceivability. But in terms of over models, of course, this is a post-Tarski phenomenon. So we shouldn't expect individuals, even mathematicians, unless they've taken a discrete mathematics course, to have a technical notion of validity in mind that they can form judgments about a particular instances over. Okay. Secondly, advocates of RE often want just particular behaviors to be indicative of our best theory of RE. So not just they say, oh, that's a good inference, or that's an acceptable inference, but they want to also say, oh, in virtue of someone doing certain behaviors, inferential behaviors, they're sanctioning that inference, or they criticize someone for making that inference. Again, that's in effect rejecting that rule of inference. While it makes sense, I think, to presume that in virtue of doing that, they are deeming a certain inference to be a good inference or bad inference, it's going quite a long way to say that they've got a concept of validity in mind, okay, when they're making these kind of judgments. So I think, again, this calls into question the viability of naive RE. The last reason, really, which I think is one of the strongest reasons for thinking that naive RE is incorrect, is that if the judgments that were informing our logic actually had the content of validity, and logical validity, then we wouldn't have such a hard time differentiating between what is a logical inference and what is a non-logical inference. So there are plenty of inferences that we make which are good inferences, which are non-logical in type. Whether they be linguistic inferences or they be mathematical inferences, we aren't able to explain their goodness in virtue of our logical theory. Now, if naive RE were correct, we should just be able to read the logicality of these inferences or the non-logicality of these inferences off the content of the judgments, but we can't do that. We have to do lots of theorizing to work out how exactly do we distinguish between logical inferences and non-logical inferences. That takes lots of work. It's a very difficult topic and is still up for debate. The fact of that operationalized RE is about to can make a lot more sense of this, because it just says all the content the judgments give us is what's a good inference and what's a bad inference. Then we have to make further judgments about actually what is it that distinguishes between the logical inferences and the non-logical. That explains why operationalized is better than naive, really. Let me just say a few words about why generalized RE is not a good idea if you're an advocate of reflective equilibrium. Some advocates of RE, such as Brun, think that you can have generalized RE. I think it's a bad idea. Firstly, because it seems to actually bring RE very close to a foundationist epistemology logic. Remember, a foundation epistemology logic proposes that we have direct access to the correct principles. So if you're saying that we have judgments about these principles, these actual logical principles, such as modus ponens or the law of non-contradiction, that makes it very close to foundationist proposals. And you can't just try to distance yourself from foundationist proposals by saying, oh, but these judgments are fallible, because lots of foundationists also think the judgments are fallible, particularly people like Bonjour. So that's a reason, firstly, to not advocate for generalized RE, saying that we have judgments about the whole laws. The second reason is that actually very rarely do we get these kinds of judgments occurring within logical disagreements or logical arguments. Just take the example from Williamson in his book Vagueness. When he's arguing it against non-classical solutions to vagueness, he doesn't appeal to the rules of inference that those non-classical approaches invalidate. What he does instead is he shows that the invalidity of those rules that the non-classical logic commits us to actually also commit us to certain individual instances being unacceptable. And that's what's really the point, okay? That those individual instances which it deems to be unacceptable, we do treat to be acceptable. And that's good evidence against these non-classical logics. So all of this to say is that if we're trying to understand how we interpret data within reflective equilibrium about logic, a naive version is by far the best version, it seems. Now, let's talk about, we've got the data side sorted. So the data now should be judgments about what's acceptable or unacceptable inferences, actual instances. What about the theory itself, though? How should we interpret the theory? There are three main ways which the theory has been interpreted. The theory has been interpreted just as the set of logical of argument forms. Okay, that's known as the extensional count. So a logic is nothing over and above the set of valid argument forms that it allows for. We also have what's called the privileged set. The privileged set proposes that it's not all of the argument forms which determine a logic, but rather certain privileged rules of inference. So this might be for each of the logical connectives, it might be the introduction and elimination rules for each of the logical connectives. And then there's the richer conception, which thinks about logical theories as being a bit similar to scientific theories. They're made up of a set of definitions, meta rules, and also laws which ultimately produce the set of argument forms. So both the privileged set conception and the richer conception agree that ultimately part of what makes something a logical theory are its set of valid argument forms. They disagree, but the equivalent of the theory just is the set of argument forms. That actually we can produce a set of argument forms through something prior to that, whether it be a set of propositions in the case of the richer conception, or it's actually just a subset of the logical rules in the case of the privileged set conception. So I just want to say a few words for why the extensional account is not very good, although it's often the most popular account in the RE literature. it's not very good because, firstly, it makes each rule of inference, each argument form independently verifiable. So if a logic is nothing other than the set of valid argument forms for any non-empty logic, L1, there is going to be a weaker logic than that, which just takes away one of the argument forms. And that means that to be able to differentiate between which of these logics is the correct one, we have to be able to each individually check each valid argument form. Okay. Now, there's good reason to think that this doesn't happen. There's good reason to think that we don't individually check the correctness or the viability of each argument form, not only because we don't actually have natural language surrogates for each of the individual argument forms. Just think about very complex cases of embedded conditionals. There are no natural language examples of this kind of reasoning, nor often are there any examples of this in mathematics. Once we get to 3 embedded conditionals, that's basically it. Mathematicians just don't bother anymore after that, okay, because they can't actually reason with them. Secondly, it doesn't explain how the fact that we often don't evaluate individual argument instances through intuitions about instances of them. We often evaluate them because they bring with them what we call bad company. So we might reject a particular rule of inference because it entails another rule of inference within the logic, which we deem to have counterexamples to. So think about the relevant logician's concern over disjunctive syllogism. That isn't because they think the disjunctive syllogism itself has counterexamples. They actually think that explosion has counterexamples, but disjunctive syllogism plus certain behavior of disjunction leads to explosion, which has counterexamples. So that means something's got to go, and what's got to go is disjunctive syllogism. So the extensional account in this sense isn't very good. Okay. Now, that would give some initial credence to the privileged proposal, the privileged set proposal, okay, which says that we don't have to justify each argument form separately. We just justify certain privileged principles that involve the connectives, and we all have to have is judgments about instances of those particular inferences. So like conjunction introduction, conjunction elimination, so on and so forth. Okay. And this actually gets around the problems which we introduced earlier about extensional, but it does still have its own problems because, firstly, this is very well known. There are certain logics which have exactly the same rules of inference. So classical logic and K3 have exactly the same rules of inference. So it can't just be the rules of inference what determine the logic. If we wanted to go beyond that to say that it's not just rules of inference, but also it's so we'd have to include there, talk about also theorems, not just rules of inference. But if we want to go beyond that, that even itself is not going to be enough because actually there are certain logics which have exactly the same rules of inference, theorems, and meta theorems as well. And meta rules. This is the case for classical logic and certain members of the ST family. It's also the case that we don't just need the rules of inference to determine a logic. We also need the correct consequence relation. Okay, we also need to determine how do we put together certain structural rules? How do we put together these certain rules of inference, and what conception, account of a logic consequence do we use to determine what's the correct theory of logic? So, and this is not often just a simple matter. Lots of proof theoretic accounts of logic and lots of supervaluationist accounts or theories of logic have very complicated or multiple accounts of what the correct logical consequence is. So we shouldn't just think that this is a simple matter. So what this tells us is that actually we need a much richer account of logical theorizing than is provided by the privileged account. So the extensional account is unrealistic. The privileged account builds upon some of the weaknesses of the extensional account, but still has its own weaknesses because actually we don't just need the rules of inference within our account of a logical theory. We also need included there a whole we need the whole hierarchy of how to understand the consequence relation, and we also need to appreciate the structural rules included in the logic, as well as exactly what the definition of the consequence is. And this definition of consequence is not a simple matter. So all of these considerations lead to us having what's called a much richer notion of logical theorizing. Something which includes within the logical theory not just these rules of inference, but also a potentially infinite hierarchy of rules of consequence relations, the structural rules which determine the consequence relation logic, and also something which I haven't talked about in any detail, but would be known for those of you who know the literature on scientific models, is that it's not enough to just have the theory that applies to the mathematics that applies to a given application or target system, but you have to have bridging principles, so rules in and out, so sometimes known as a translation manual. So in the context of RE, if I'm going to say that the data informs the theory, I need to show how that data maps onto the theory to impact it. And similarly, if I'm saying that a certain logical principle is valid, I need to know how what I would expect to be the case in the data if that logical principle were correct. So I need to have a translation manual between the two, just like you do between two languages. If I'm trying to successfully translate this language here, what would I expect my translation to be exactly? Okay, what would I expect native speakers' judgments about this particular sentence to be? Okay, so all of these considerations lead to us to thinking that it's got to be a richer account of logical theorizing, something which isn't acknowledged very much in the RE literature. I haven't got a lot of time here, so I'm not going to talk about lots of the complications that come up with embracing a richer account. Let me say that if you want to ask me in the Q&A, I'm very happy to answer some of these or elaborate if I've got more time later on. But there are problems with understanding exactly what this richer account looks like. But it's clear that neither the extensional account nor the privileged set account of a logical theory is going to suffice. The third dimension, which I could talk about very, very quickly, is, according to Goodman, he thought that reflective equilibrium was, he didn't have this nomenclature at the time, but he thought the only data relevant to RE was just our initial judgments about what's a good inference and what's a bad inference. That is known as narrow RE. So the only suitable data that informs our theory of validity, our logical theory, are just judgments over particular cases of arguments. That is to be contrasted with wide RE, which is that in addition to these considerations about instances of inferences, we can also build in certain commitments at the background level. So these could be, we don't know exactly what these commitments are yet. That's going to depend on the context, whether we're talking about theories of logic or theories about ethics or theories about political philosophy. But the idea is that certain other, it becomes a tripart theory where there's a third part, which is background commitments. And we can assess the theory not only its consistency with the data in terms of the judgments about instances, but also about the coherence with the background commitments. Now, let us just say that almost certainly narrow RE is not going to be suitable when we look at the logical data, when we look at how logical theorizing actually works, because we take into account many considerations via the paradoxes, which aren't just initial judgments about argument instances. We take into account our theory of truth, which is shown by both the Curry paradox and also the liar paradoxes. The liar paradox is caused by our theory, a naive theory of truth, as well as semantic closure and certain classical rules of inference. And also, if you look at other paradoxes, such as the Sorites paradox, this is caused ultimately by us recognizing certain other linguistic facts, such as the existence of putatively vague predicates. If there weren't such vague predicates, we wouldn't have the problem of the Sorites paradox. Okay, and of course, there are other also mathematical theories, such as in case of like the Russell set, there's the problem of naive set theory. Okay, and also other areas as well, such as other paradoxes within mathematics, or wanting to account for certain practices of mathematicians. So the general point is that almost certainly narrow RE is not going to be acceptable. If we want to have a reasonable version of RE for let's about logic, it's going to have to be a version of wide RE. So that's going to have to definitely be the version that we're going to have to include for our optimal version. Okay. Before I conclude, I've got one last point, last variable. So far, what we've established is that if we're going to have an optimal version of RE, we need to embrace an operationalized version or understanding of the logical data. That's our judgments about instances of arguments. We need to have a richer conception of logical theories. So not just in terms of thinking about logical theories as a set of valid argument forms or a set of privileged rules of inference of whether that be in terms of introduction elimination rules for the logical connectives, but a richer notion of a logical theory, which is much closer to the scientific one, which includes rules, definitions, and also certain translation rules in and out of the model into the phenomenon, trying to show how the data is assessed by the theory. And we need to include a wider sources of logical evidence beyond just the judgments over instances of arguments, but also certain background commitments, linguistic, mathematical, so on and so forth. The last factor is whether we ought to interpret RE as an individualistic enterprise, so that we all start with our initial judgments about what's a good or a bad argument, and then we form our logical principles, or this is a communal enterprise where we try to together form it's a communal collaborative enterprise where we try to firstly decide what constitutes the relevant data. Okay, and we decide upon what are good judgments and what are bad, what are good instances of arguments, what are bad instances of arguments, and then from that initial data, we then try to extrapolate or formalize or theorize about the correct logic based upon these initial judgment points. Now, some in the literature, such as Resnick, have proposed that actually logic is much more like ethics than it is about like the sciences. So actually, each of us, he is what we call expressivist. So he has the view that actually there are no logical facts. All when we say modus ponens is valid, all we mean by that really is that I personally infer according to modus ponens, or I find instances of modus ponens acceptable. So that's a very individualistic proposal, that we all have our initial judgments about what's a good or a bad argument, and then we, in effect, based on that data, we inform our own theory. So we can all have our own reflective equilibrium, our own acceptable logic based upon our own, in effect, ethics of reasoning. That's the idea. Now, I think this proposal is very unrealistic and actually is contrary to how logic is actually proposed. So here are three problems with the individualistic account of how logical theorizing works according to RE. Firstly, generally speaking, logicians agree over the data, particularly mathematical data. So almost all research programs within the history of mathematical logic, at least, as in when I say mathematical logic, I mean post Frege and Russell, propose that the inferences that mathematicians make need to be taken into account when we're formalizing or evidencing the correct logic. So that data is robust, and we agree on that data has to be taken into account. Just like you might say that if we were trying to provide the best model of epidemiology for a particular disease, we would say that the R rate ought to be taken into account as a viable piece of data. Okay, or how many people get ill is a viable piece of data when judging, and in what speed. That's a viable piece of data when evaluating epidemiological models. Similarly, logicians agree that when it comes to theories of validity, we have to take into account whether the judgments of mathematicians over instances of in informal proofs, whether they conform with the logical theory or not. Secondly, logical theorizing is competitive. By that, I mean when two logicians come up with their own theories of what the best logic is, they don't just leave themselves to it. Okay, they don't just say, I've got my own theory, which is a reflective equilibrium to my own judgments about inferential instances, and you've got yours, and they're not in any way incompatible with one another. We're not in tension. Our views aren't in tension with one another. That is not true whatsoever. They challenge one another on those reflective equilibria. They give reasons for thinking that those logics are not the correct logic. They give reasons to think that, based upon judgments about individual instances, this individual instance of an argument is incompatible with your proposal. Okay, this is how historically classical logicians have argued against non-classical logicians. So Burgess gave instances of destructive syllogism and showed that mathematicians rely upon those instances when trying to argue against relevant logic, even though relevant logic deems destructive syllogism to be invalid. The fact they engage in this kind of theorizing and challenge shows that actually this reflective equilibrium process is not individualistic; it's communal. Okay, and of course, the whole thing of peer review, where logicians send in their philosophically minded logicians send in their papers, argue for a particular proposal. The fact that other logicians can evaluate these proposals based upon a certain set agreed of standards and data shows that this process is communal, not individualistic. So if all these processes in terms of how to evaluate the data, what the initial data were, and how to best revise our theory on the basis of that data, if that were all individualistic, we couldn't even really have this peer review process. Okay, so that's all of my considerations when it comes to how we ought to think about the best version of RE. I think what I'm going to do for the moment is leave it there, because I've been talking for quite a long time. And if I have some more time, I can expand on why I think even this optimal version of RE is no good. Okay, there's certain problems with the optimal version. If I've got other questions which stop me from going into that detail, then that's also okay, because I can share the handout and the slides which point out some of these problems with this operation, this optimal version of RE. What I wanted to really get across in this talk was very much like, it's not as though there's one version of RE. There are many different versions that we need to break down, and we can find a optimal version of RE by picking out different particular versions of these variables. So the take-home point, hopefully for everyone who's seen this, is that if you want to endorse the best version of RE when it comes to logic, you should interpret the data in an operationalized version, not in a naive version. You need to have a richer conception of a logical theory. You need to interpret your scope of data in a very much a wide sense, not just in a narrow sense, which include background assumptions or background evidence. And also, this is very much a communal process, not an individualistic process, contrary to what some people propose. Thank you very much.
Hi, Ben. Thank you, Ben, for your very rich presentation. And I was looking forward for this final remarks.
Well, I can elaborate. I can do it now if I haven't run out of time. Do I have 5 minutes?
Yeah, but listen, maybe you can make I can pose some 2 questions for you, and you can kind of summarize.
Exactly. That's what I thought.
Things.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some. I know that you're very interested in epistemology of logic as well, and have some work on deep disagreements as well. So I was wondering, the image that I have when I try to create my mind some image of what is going on, a reflective equilibrium process, in order to get this kind of balance between more general principles and also the instances, these are particular instances, and bring this to this kind of mutual adjustment. I really think about the Neurath's boat metaphor.
Yes.
Because I think it's very, in a sense, very visual. In a sense, you're in a boat, there is no dock there, you're in the middle of the sea, and you have to kind of rebuild and fix your own boat, use the material that you have inside the boat because you don't have any kind of outside material there, and then try to accommodate some problems that you have in this rebuilding with more general instructions that you have and the material and the content you have inside the boat. I think it's very, I don't know what you think about that, but it's a good image for what's going on in this fractal equilibrium, and it's a non-fundamentalist way of seeing things as well in this epistemological approach. But in a sense, and that's the first question I would like to make, and then you can. The first one is, I mean, why this image, the whole image of reflective equilibrium, is not a monist way of revising logic as well? Because it's a kind of, you are inside of the Neurath's boat, and you have a logic there, and you want to fix, you fix the logic inside the logic, and you don't leave the logic there in order to I do not see the plurality of logic as how we have this kind of disagreements, and maybe we have collaborative things, but inside the same boat. But when you have several boats, in a sense, how can we deal with this equilibrium among the boats? And when those boats are rivals, it seems to me to be a monist process. And that brings for my second question. I didn't see you addressing a big problem concerning this kind of non-foundationalist approach to epistemology or epistemological problem, which is the problem of circularity. The process seems to be circular in a sense, because in order to fix or revise one logic, you have to presuppose the logic in order to do these adjustments between the general process and also the particular inference. And I was wondering how you can use this both. And of course, we have this Neurath's boat image and this non-collaborative but rivals boats in a sense, and also this problem of circularity. And you can use also to develop a little bit more what do you think about this.
So I mean those are some. There's a lot of
presentation. Sorry.
Yeah, a lot of very rich questions there. I'm going to take the last one first, if that's okay, and let me just go back to, because again, this is something I didn't have time to discuss. So I'm going to go back to the second slide where I distinguish between foundationalist and non-foundationalist epistemology of logic. So one of the reasons why foundationalists are often unsatisfied with non-foundationalist epistemology of logic is because what they say is, of course, if you're going to suggest that there's some data and we're going to assess our logical theory on the basis of this data, we need to assess whether that data is compatible, consistent, or inconsistent with the theory. And of course, that itself is using logic. So how can I evaluate a logic on the basis of data when I already have to presuppose certain logical principles? I either am relying upon a logical principle already included in the resultant theory, in which case I've just begged the question against other logics, or I'm using a logical principle where my final theory, my logical theory, actually invalidates it. In which case I've just to use a quote from both Sextus Empiricus and also Wittgenstein, I've kicked the ladder from beneath me. Okay, so how can I possibly rely upon rules of inference or logical inferences to justify the consistency of the data with the theory? This is a problem which, of course, has been was thought to be a problem for Quine's evidential holism. And it's a problem for all non-foundationalist epistemology of logic, and it's given several names. It's given the name of the centrality problem, which was given by Christian Wright. It's also sometimes called the background logic problem. That's the term that Ulrich Hüller, myself, and Jack Woods tends to use. It's also sometimes called the metalogical problem, like what metalogic are you using when you're talking about your object language? Now, I do have my own should I say, tentative solution to this, which I'm writing about in a book on the epistemology of logic that I'm writing for Cambridge University Press. And the answer to this is, my response to the problem actually is this, is that when we are assessing, or let me say, there is a difference between the epistemology of reasoning or making certain inferences and the epistemology of the particular rules of logic. And actually, the goodness or our reliability at making instances of inferences does not depend upon ultimately us having our theory of logic. By that I actually mean that I think that the reliability of the inferences comes way before the theorizing. So that means that I'm allowed to judge whether something follows from something else or is a good inference, independently of whether my logical theory ultimately systematizes that inference. Okay, so for example, even if I weren't to have classical logic, it would still be the case that the inferences that classical mathematicians make in their informal proofs are good inferences. So they are not dependent upon us coming up with classical logic to justify that. So I think that through some kind of reliabilist framework, which relies upon a particular metaphysics of logic, that we can judge whether some data supports a theory independently of having a correct theory of logic prior, or presupposing the correct theory of logic. That's my own response to the background logic problem or the centrality problem. That I think that once you distinguish between these two determined epistemologies, so the epistemology of what's good reasoning, even good logical reasoning, and the epistemology of logical theorizing, as long as we see those two things as two separate things, they're apart from one another, it's not a problem that we have to presuppose certain inferences being good inferences in supporting our logical theory. That's not that much of a problem. When it comes to the collaborative point in terms of Neurest boat, I agree with you completely. So lots of the Neurest boat analogy only really made sense while we had one game in town, when we had one logic, which we could then take parts from or fix in certain points. And you might think that some of this did happen when it came to the classical, to the non-classical logics, particularly paraconsistent logics, but it doesn't make sense of certain other very core disagreements between intuitionistic logicians and classical logicians. They were on very different boats. That wasn't a case of like just changing certain planks and putting new planks in. That was just having a completely different boat, basically. So whereas in relevant logics, you've taken away certain of the classical planks and putting new ones in, and also similarly with paraconsistent movements, certainly you were taking away certain planks and putting new ones in. That's not what happened with intuitionistic account whatsoever. It also doesn't explain how we got the boat in the first place. So one of the criticisms I'm a predictivist about logic. I think that what happens is that we had certain initial judgments, and then we had to come up with hypothesized big theories, and then we test those theories. The Neurest boat proposal doesn't explain how we got the boat in the first place. It doesn't explain how we got the theory in the first place. You have to have built the boat in the first place. How do we do that? We weren't at sea when we built the boat. So how do we build the boat in the first place? So I don't like in that respect, I also find the Neurest boat analogy, although it's useful for teaching purposes and pedagogical purposes and for thought experiment purposes, it's not a very good, I don't think, metaphor for how we actually do logical theorizing. Not from the beginnings anyway, not from how we started off our logical theorizing.
Very nice point, Martin. I think it's very illustrative in a sense, this kind of image of the Neurest boats and this kind of talk. I would make another question, but I think Evelyn Evelyn from Bergen as well made a comment here. I think there is definitely room for plurality, since reflective equilibrium allows, in principle, for different equality rational equilibria to be reached from the same data if different adjustments are made. So maybe you can.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the debate over individualistic or communal, and I think that's it's an excellent point from Evelyn. But I think the problem is that it's skipped on as well here. I don't know why that happened. So there are no arguments for a form of logical pluralism. Okay, so here are two different ways you go here. Right? So you shouldn't interpret the individualistic approach as resulting in what we call logical pluralism. So logical pluralism is the idea that everyone has reason to endorse multiple logics. The individualistic proposal is rather that each individual may come up with their own reflective equilibria, or their own equilibrium, so there are multiple equilibria, on the basis of their initial judgments and how their tolerance for revising their theory on the basis of the data. That's basically it. There are different threshold levels when it comes to evaluating the theory on the basis of the data. Now, for that individualistic proposal to make sense, we shouldn't have any robust data. Okay, but actually, the problem is that the data in logic is robust. No one takes a research program in logic seriously unless it can accommodate vast swathes of the inferences that mathematicians make in informal proofs. It just wouldn't pass muster. Not only that, but if the projects were individualistic, it wouldn't make sense really for each logician to try to persuade the other logician that they're incorrect in the equilibrium they came up with, they resulted in. They might say, well, that's interesting. Why did you come up with that particular equilibrium? I came up with this one. But it would just be a point of interest. They wouldn't actually argue one another over what the correct one was. They would all be equally viable given their own threshold levels and their own initial judgments over instances. So we shouldn't expect this competitive element of logic. In fact, the whole, like I tried to suggest, but too briefly perhaps, the whole enterprise of peer review presupposes that there are these shared norms of evaluating the suitability of the data and evaluating the how we ought to revise the theory on the basis of the data, given the potential tension of the theory and the data, just like we get in the sciences. And so basically, I actually think that lots of the problems when it comes to reflective equilibrium, when it comes to logic, are very similar to the problems when people have tried to apply it to the sciences, which is that it just doesn't give enough priority to the data. The data is far more robust than people give it credit for. It's far more robust. And the norms of evaluating theory on the basis of data are far more communal, far more established than actually, again, RE gives the process the credit for. But thanks, good question. Thanks.
And I would like to ask you a little another one. I didn't quite understand your criticism against a more expressivist point of view concerning this discussion on the nature of logic and also the possibility of equilibrium, reflective equilibrium.
Yeah,
because
good. Yes,
it seems that you're connected to a more individualistic view, in a sense, when people are kind of deciding and deliberating alone by their own what to do to reach this kind of equilibrium. But I do not really see that this consequence follows necessarily from an expressivist point of view, because you can, and that is concerning your problem with the Neurath vote. How do we get the first vote from the start, and also the problem of the meta logic in a sense, the meta language in a sense, because if you are an expressivist like this Pittsburgh school or brand or style of expressivism, you have already the social background there, and this is set by the natural language for itself. So, in a sense, the first boat that we have is the natural language, because the natural language has all this material inference that articulate the meaning of our linguistic expressions. And what we can do with logical systems and theories is to make explicit this kind of material inference and try to regimentate this in different formal systems as well. Yeah? So it can be a non-individualistic, collaborative and collective, social, communal enterprise from the beginning. So the boat is already there when you have this natural language, because this proto-logic is kind of there.
Yep. So I agree with almost everything you said. So I wasn't trying to suggest that. So expressivism is a metaphysical position about logic, not an epistemological position. So expressivism proposes that there in effect are no facts about logic. What logic just is just the codification. Logical principles are just the codification of our own preferences for or actions when it comes to inferences. I wasn't trying to suggest that necessarily, if you're an expressivist about logic, you're committed to an individualistic interpretation of RE. What I was just saying is that the only individualistic interpretations of RE that I could find were those who also were committed to expressivism. So Resnick. There certainly are possibilities for a communal interpretation of RE if you're an expressivist. I think, for example, there are some expressivists who are communal at the moment. So I think that there are some people who hold that view. I am, however, so Brandon may be one of them. Okay, the Pittsburgh School. I have to say, I think those expressivists do have a challenge, though, which is that it seems quite hard for that expressivism, if it's communal, not to collapse into a form of conventionalism a la Jared Warren, which is that if logical norms or facts, or non-committal facts, let's just say that logical principles are in effect just the codification of the inferential norms that we tend to adhere to in our day-to-day lives or in mathematical enterprises. It's very hard for the expressivists not to just fall into conventionalism, which says that these logical principles are correct in virtue of these particular inferences that we make. So in effect, those norms flow out of the instances of the inferences. That's what explains why this is a good inference or that's a bad inference. I do think the expressivists have a big deal explaining or have a challenge there, differentiate themselves from the conventionalists if they're collaborative. But I don't want to go too much detail there because I think that I'm not sure exactly what's going to break the deadlock, what's going to differentiate between the conventionalists and the expressivists there. But I think the expressivist is getting very close there to conventionalism.
Cool, man. But I do think that this data that you call this robust data could be for an expressivist in order to avoid conventionalism. Could be natural language, so our relevant practice, the relevant practice of maybe specialist in logic as well. So it's not that arbitrary in a sense. We want to express some commitments that people have when they are doing their daily reasonings. And the natural language is open for, it's not classical and it's non-monotonic, and there are vague predicates and also collapse and also conflict information. And we have to, we have this system, the logical system, and they are not arbitrary in a sense. They're not. But we have to compare it in a sense to the uses that we have when you use natural language and we do our daily inferences as well. So I think this could be a viable way out of what you're seeing in order to differentiate expressivism to a more conventional, I suppose.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I mean, both the conventionalist and the expressivist will have to somehow protect mathematical inferences, because if you want your logic to be applicable to mathematics, you certainly can't include all the type of inferences that we deem to be acceptable or unacceptable, whether based upon linguistic norms or based upon certain certain expressions that we just find acceptable or deem acceptable through our communal norms, because of course these don't adhere to classical logic often. And so if we want to treat the mathematical data as robust, we either have to say this is a different enterprise for logic. So logics of validity are dealing just with mathematics and maybe the sciences, what underlies the inferences made by the sciences, or we're going to have a much weaker logic, obviously a non-monotonic logic, because of course the kind of reason, as we know, is not monotonic. So yeah, they're going to have to do some kind of protection there of mathematics as a different enterprise.
Cool, Ben. And now we have a more practical question here. When is the book coming out?
Next year.
When the paper is coming out as well. So we can read it.
It's still under R&R, so it's still under review. But I hope that it's going to be out soon. Yeah.
So cool. So we set this kind of limit of 1 hour and a half and something. Yeah. Now we have to invite you for the second part of to this final part of your talk. Maybe you want to have kind of 5 minutes?
Yeah, I can in 5 minutes. Yeah, so I can certainly just talk about certain and some things I've already mentioned. So so the optimal version that I painted of RE, I think still has some problems, and it's got 3 main problems, I think, which is one of and each of these is identified by predictivism, which is the proposal that I with Ulla Hewland I prefer. So let me just say what I think these 3 problems are. So the first is that the RE about logic sees both the data and the theory as being malleable. So all that matters is that you can ultimately get them to rest in equilibrium with one another. It doesn't really matter actually where you make the fixes. What the prime criterion is that you do get them to rest in some form of reflective equilibrium with one another. But what reflective equilibrium doesn't recognize is that actually the data is far more robust, particularly, as I've said, mathematical inferences, the inferences that mathematicians make. It's far more robust than the theory gives it credit for. We can't just change the data to fit with our theory. The theory almost always answers the data when we're thinking about the mathematical inferences made. We don't get to say to mathematicians, "Oh no, sorry, you've made the wrong kind of inference here." Okay, this is recognized in certain ways. This is recognized historically in the syllogistic logic case, where syllogistic logic was accepted as being the correct logic all the way up to Venn and Boole and Frege, but it was recognized as having a problem. And it couldn't, because it couldn't codify the kinds of inferences made by mathematicians. And this was known to be a problem with theory. So the only reason why we didn't get rid of the theory is because we didn't have a better version of it. And British logicians before Frege were spending loads of time trying to work out how to fix syllogistic logic to try to make it compatible with the inferences that mathematicians make. So that recognizes that we couldn't just change the data to fit in with the theory. We had to somehow change the theory to fit with the data. The second example of this that shows this really nicely is non-classical logicians. So paroxysm logicians accept almost always, the only exception here I think is Zach Weber, and this is also true of redundant logicians, they recognize that whatever logic we ultimately have has to sanction the inferences that mathematicians make. which means that we need to have a recapture for classical reasoning within mathematical context. So again, they all accept that that data is robust. So we don't have the same malleability between the data and the theory, which reflective equilibrium suggests. That's the first problem, okay? So there are pieces of logical data which are robust, contrary to what RE suggests. RE suggests that everything's up for grabs. That's not true. The second problem is that, again, RE suggests that all that matters in the logical theorizing is a fit, some kind of reflective equilibrium between the two. But actually, logicians are interested in more than just the fit between the data and the theory. They're interested in just trying to explain the underlying phenomenon. They want their theory to have more than just fit with the data. They want it to have some explanatory power when it comes to what validity is. They don't just want to say this inference is a valid inference. They want to explain why with the components of the theory. Reflective equilibrium doesn't include that within their picture. They just include trying to show that this is a good, they just want to sort inferences into good inference or valid inferences and invalid inferences. They don't have this explanatory part of the theory. I don't have time to go into detail on exactly why we ought to think that logical theorism does have the explanatory power. Let me just give you one example of this. If all we cared about was sorting inferences into valid inferences and invalid inferences, then we shouldn't ever have disagreement between individuals who accept the same logic, but we do. So we have different semantics for the same logics. The most famous example of this is probably in relevant logic, the Australian plan versus the American plan, where the American plan used a multi-valued logic to model relevant logics, and the Australian plan they used a modal logic, a very complicated modal logic that had these operators called the Rawls star. And many people who embrace the American plan criticize the Australasian plan because the semantics it used didn't have explanatory power. We didn't know how to interpret the Rawls star. Like, what is this Rawls star? It doesn't. Yes, sure, it delivers the right argument forms, but it doesn't tell us why those argument forms are valid due to the behavior of the connectives. So this shows that explanatory power does also have plays a value. One final point, because I've got 3 minutes left. According to RE, if there's a clash, they have to be brought into the data, and the theory have to be brought into line with one another. It doesn't matter how it's done, really. The prime criteria is that it has to happen. But actually, the interesting thing is that we've had whole periods in logical theorizing where that hasn't happened, and we've accepted it. We've accepted where our best logical theory is inconsistent with the data, but we haven't changed the data because the data is robust. And a nice example of this is syllogistic logic, which I just gave you a moment ago. What syllogistic logicians didn't do is they didn't say, oh no, the data is inconsistent with the logic, I better change the data, or I better just change the logic willy-nilly, as long as I get consistency. No, what they said was, what this shows is that we do ultimately need a better theory, but that doesn't come up overnight. Just like in the sciences, we might have some data which is recalcitrant, which is inconsistent with the theory, but we can't just evaluate the theory or the data on the basis of inconsistency. We have to either hope that the data is deemed to be ultimately unreliable, or that we can come up with a better theory ultimately. But at the moment, this is the best theory we've got. We just stick with it, and we can't just reject the data. So again, we don't just somehow resolve the incompatibility when we want to. We often have, over long periods, unresolved anomalies, which is contrary to what reflective equilibrium suggests. Because reflective equilibrium should say that, no, we ought to, whenever there's an inconsistency, resolve that. We don't often resolve that tension. We often have that tension for many, many years. Many, many years. So, all too brief again. I must just mention, I have to go on to the last slide because I have to say thank you to my funding body for this research. So I have to get in there, otherwise I get in trouble.
Okay, cool. Many thanks, Ben, for your time and
thank
for
you
being here and for your support for our initiative in our Brazilian Society for Analytical Philosophy. You're much welcome here in Brazil. So when you visit South America as well. you can present also your ideas here and your new book as well, and also
I hope to come and visit. Yeah.
Maybe the next year we can make a release of your official release, a South American release of your book during our meeting, so we can talk about it.
Who knows? Maybe, yes, that would be nice. Yes.
Because by July next year, your book is already released, so you can.
Yeah, I would hope so. Yeah.
I hope so too. Okay, thank you, people. Thank you all. Thank you, Ben Martin, and see you. Let me end it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.